I saved him from bankruptcy. He repaid me with betrayal, stole my company, took my friends, left me with nothing. Until I took it all back. Hello, friends, my name's Daniel Cole, and if you're listening to this, you've probably been burned by someone you trusted. Maybe not the same way I was, but close enough that the scar feels familiar. I'm not telling this story for pity. I'm telling it because sometimes the only way to make sense of what happened is to lay it all out, piece by piece, and show you exactly how the knife was sharpened before it was slid between your ribs. When I met him, Marcus Hale, he wasn't just broke. He was hollow. His office was stripped bare. His employees were trickling out like rats from a sinking ship, and his phone wouldn't stop ringing with creditors. I could have walked away. God knows I had my own battles at the time, but Marcus had this way of looking at you, like you were the last lifeboat in an ocean of fire. And I've always been the kind of fool who sees a drowning man and jumps in after him. We signed the deal in his dusty conference room, 2 signatures on a stack of papers that meant I would pour my capital, my connections, and my time into pulling his company from the edge. In return, we'd split profits 50-50. It wasn't just business, it was brotherhood. At least that's what I thought. First months were chaos, 12-hour days, nights sleeping on the office couch, my hands in everything from marketing to fixing the damn coffee machine. We started to win again. Clients returned. The phones rang with new contracts instead of debt collectors. Marcus and I would share late, night Chinese takeout, laughing about how one day we'd tell people about the dark days when it was just us against the world. But here's the thing about saving someone once they're safe. They start to forget they ever needed saving. The first crack came quietly. A meeting I wasn't invited to. A contract signed without my signature. I brushed it off. Then came the whispers from staff. Marcus says he's the sole owner. He says you're just an investor. I didn't want to believe it. Not Marcus, not my partner, not my friend, and then, one morning, I walked into my office and my nameplate was gone. I'll tell you exactly how he took everything from me and how I took it all back, piece by calculated piece. But first, you need to understand the kind of man Marcus Hale really was, and the one I had to become to bring him down. Marcus Hale wasn't born a villain. At least not in the way stories usually paint them. He had charm, the easy kind that slipped into a room before he did, making people lean in without realizing they were giving him something valuable, their trust. I'd seen him close deals on nothing more than a napkin sketch and a smile. That's what made his fall so strange. People like Marcus don't just lose everything overnight. They drain it slowly like a leak you can't find until the ceiling caves in. When I met him, I thought I was staring at a man who'd been wronged by bad luck, bad timing, and maybe a few bad friends. But later, I realized he'd been sharpening his survival instincts on other people's backs his whole life. The night before I signed those papers, we sat in a bar with sticky floors and bad lighting. He told me about his childhood, the single mom who worked 2 jobs, the father who walked out, the scholarships that got him into business school. I remember thinking, this man deserves a second chance. That night, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "If I make it through this, Dan, I swear I'll never forget what you did for me." He didn't just forget, he rewrote the story. It started with the website. I was scrolling through our homepage late one night and my bio was gone. My title had been changed from co-founder to consultant. My photo, the one we'd taken together, replaced with a shot of Marcus, arms crossed, smiling like he'd built the empire from scratch. I confronted him in the hallway the next morning. He laughed it off. Marketing thought it'd be cleaner this way. Too many faces confuse the brand. He clapped me on the shoulder, the way you might with a friend, but there was a weight in that touch, a message I couldn't quite decode at the time. Weeks later, I caught him meeting with one of our biggest clients without telling me. That client, a multi-million-dollar account, suddenly stopped returning my calls. When I finally got through, the secretary said, "Oh, I thought you weren't with the company anymore." That was the day I stopped playing defense. I didn't storm into his office. I didn't yell. Instead, I sat down in my apartment that night, poured myself a drink, and made a list. Every asset I'd brought in, every contract I'd closed, every employee I'd hired, every favor I'd called in. And then I started tracing the threads of the company back to me. I was going to let Marcus dig his own grave. I would just make sure I owned the land he was buried in. But before I could take back what was mine, I had to find the one weakness Marcus Hale could never defend against. And I knew exactly where to look. Marcus's weakness wasn't greed, that was his strength. Greed made him relentless, tireless, willing to step over anyone to get to the top. No, his real weakness was vanity. It wasn't the kind of vanity you see in a man who spends hours in front of the mirror. This was deeper, a hunger to be seen, to be celebrated, to have every win pinned to his chest like a medal. He couldn't stand the thought of someone else getting credit for what he thought was his moment. That was the crack in his armor, and I was going to pry it wide open. The first step was subtle. I started showing up less. Not enough to raise alarms, just enough to make him feel like the stage was all his. The more he believed I was fading into the background, the more reckless he became. His emails to clients were careless, promises he couldn't keep. His expense reports ballooned. He started throwing lavish dinners for investors that never materialized. Meanwhile, I was building my own network behind the scenes. Every contract I'd brought in, I called those clients personally. Not to tell them what Marcus had done, not yet, but to check in, to see how they were feeling about the partnership. I took notes on every complaint, every delay, every corner Marcus cut. They didn't know it, but they were giving me the blueprint for dismantling him. The employees were easier. Most of them had been hired on my recommendation, and they remembered the nights I stayed late to help them finish projects, the lunches I bought when payroll was late. One by one, I invited them out for coffee, not to talk about Marcus, to talk about them. Their goals, their frustrations, their doubts. People open up when they feel heard. And the more they opened up, the more they confirmed what I already knew. Marcus was treating the company like his personal kingdom, and his people like disposable pawns. Then came the gold mine. A former supplier Marcus had stiffed on payment months before I joined. They'd been blacklisted from working with him, but they still had all the records. Payment histories, email chains, even voice messages. I didn't have to dig deep to find inconsistencies, missed payments hidden under administrative errors. Overbilling clients for services never delivered. Individually, they were small enough to explain away. Together, they were a noose, but I didn't rush. Revenge isn't about speed. It's about patience. It's about letting your target believe they've won so completely that they stop watching their back. The turning point came on a Thursday evening. I was in my apartment, sifting through old meeting notes, when an email from Marcus popped up. It was short, almost smug. "Dan, we need to talk about your role moving forward. I think it's time you stepped back completely. I'll have legal draft the paperwork. No meeting, no phone call. Just an eviction notice from the company I had saved." I stared at the screen for a long time before I laughed. Not the kind of laugh you share over drinks. The kind that comes from somewhere dark, somewhere deep, somewhere that knows exactly how this ends. Marcus had just handed me the final piece I needed, because stepping back, that's exactly what I wanted him to think I was doing. I didn't reply to Marcus's email, not that night, not the next day. Silence was my first move. People like Marcus hate silence. They feed on reactions of the angry calls, the desperate pleas, the slammed doors. They want you to lash out so they can paint you as irrational, unprofessional, unhinged. By giving him nothing, I left him alone in his own head. And a man like that will start to imagine threats that aren't even there. Instead, I started laying the groundwork. First, I contacted every client I'd brought into the company quietly, off the record. I told them I was considering a new venture and would love to keep working with them personally should the opportunity arise. I didn't badmouth Marcus. I didn't have to. The pauses in their voices, the sighs, to be honest, told me everything. Next, I reached out to a lawyer, not the kind you find in a Google search, but an old friend who owed me more than a few favors. We combed through the original partnership agreement. Buried in the fine print was a clause I'd forgotten about, a contingency that allowed me to claim intellectual property rights to any processes, branding, or strategies I had created during my tenure, and I had created everything: the marketing campaigns, the client onboarding system, the pricing model, even the company slogan. All mine. Then came the employees. I didn't recruit them, not yet. I simply let them know I was available to talk if they ever needed advice, or a reference, or just someone to vent to. Word travels fast in a small office, and before long, half the team was messaging me after hours, telling me about Marcus's outbursts, his shady spending, the sudden missing bonuses. But the real trap was financial. I had one final meeting with a silent investor, a man who'd been watching Marcus from the sidelines and didn't like what he saw. We agreed on a simple deal. If I could pull the key accounts away from Marcus, he'd fund my new company immediately. No delays, no questions. All I needed now was the perfect moment to make my move. That moment came faster than I expected. Marcus had booked himself a high-profile industry event in Los Angeles, a gala where he planned to unveil our new corporate direction. He hadn't invited me. Of course not, but he didn't know that half the clients in that ballroom already had my number. 2 days before the gala, I made my calls. One by one, I invited those clients to coffee, to dinner, to quiet conversations away from Marcus's spotlight. I told them about my vision: transparent, ethical, profitable. I showed them the numbers, the strategies, the path forward. By the time Marcus was on stage giving his speech, the room was full of smiles he thought were for him when they were already mine. I remember watching the live stream from my apartment. Marcus stood there in his tailored suit, basking in applause, believing he'd finally erased me from the story. He had no idea that the contracts in his briefcase were already worthless, because the people who signed them had already promised me their business. The noose was tightening, and I was just getting started. The day after the gala, Marcus walked into the office thinking he'd just cemented his empire. I know this because one of the junior managers, someone who'd been feeding me updates, called to tell me he was strutting down the hall like a king returning from war. He had no idea the war was already over. That morning, I filed the paperwork. Every legal form, every notarized signature, every clause that transferred ownership of the intellectual property back to me. The company's operating systems, client databases, onboarding templates, marketing campaigns, all of it was legally mine the second the ink dried. Without those, his business was a hollow shell. Then I made my calls, not to Marcus, to the clients. I thanked them for their loyalty, told them I was moving forward under a new name, and assured them that the transition would be seamless. Most of them didn't even hesitate. When can we start? Was the question I heard over and over. By the time I hung up the last call, over 70% of his active contracts were gone. And I wasn't finished. That afternoon I met with the investor. We shook hands, signed our own deal, and by evening my new company, Cole Strategies, was officially born. It wasn't just a rebirth, it was an evolution. I had the clients, the infrastructure, the funding, and the trust Marcus had squandered. The next morning I sent Marcus a single email, no threats, no anger, just facts. Marcus, as of today, all intellectual property I created under our partnership is no longer licensed to your company. You are legally prohibited from using any of it moving forward. Clients associated with those systems have been notified. Best of luck, Daniel Cole. I wish I could have seen his face when he read it. Instead, I got the next best thing, a voicemail. His voice was tight, like someone squeezing the air out of him. He accused me of sabotage, of betrayal, of destroying everything we built. And maybe I had destroyed his version of it. But mine was just beginning. Within 3 weeks, his office was a ghost town. Employees walked out in waves, joining me one by one. The clients didn't come back, creditors did. By the second month, Marcus had sold off the furniture and was operating out of his condo. I didn't celebrate, I didn't post about it online, I just kept working, building, growing. Because revenge isn't about the victory dance. It's about making sure they never get close enough to hurt you again. And Marcus, last I heard, he's pitching ideas to anyone who will listen, telling a story about how his consultant ruined him. Funny thing is, in every version, he never mentions how I saved him first. But I remember everything. And that's the thing about people like Marcus. They think they're erasing you. But sometimes you're just giving them enough rope to hang their own story. I thought taking Marcus down would feel like a finish line, like crossing that tape, arms raised, knowing the race was over. But it wasn't. It was more like walking off the battlefield and realizing the world was suddenly quiet. Too quiet. In those first weeks after his collapse, I kept expecting some last counterattack, a smear campaign, a lawsuit, a desperate attempt to poach clients back. But there was nothing, just silence, and in that silence I found something I didn't realize I'd been missing for years. Space to breathe. I poured myself into Cole's strategies. We weren't just surviving, we were thriving. Within 6 months, we doubled our projected revenue. The office buzzed with a kind of energy I hadn't felt in years, the kind that comes when everyone believes in what they're building. No lies, no hidden agendas, no walking on eggshells around an unpredictable boss. I hired back some of the employees Marcus had driven away long before my exit. People who'd left the industry entirely because they thought all companies were like his. I gave them room to grow, to lead, to create. And the loyalty that came from that, you can't buy it. But the real shift came when I stopped checking over my shoulder. For so long, I'd been in fight mode, every decision a counterpunch, every move calculated to stay one step ahead. It took time to unlearn that, to realize that winning wasn't just about taking something from Marcus, it was about building something he could never touch. One night, about a year later, I was closing up the office when I got a message from an unknown number. Just 4 words, "You really got me," no name, no context, but I didn't need one. I stared at that message for a long time before I finally set my phone down and walked out into the cool night air. It didn't feel like victory, not anymore. It felt like release. Marcus had been my greatest mistake and my greatest teacher. He taught me that trust without caution is a loaded gun in someone else's hand, that generosity needs boundaries, and that the best revenge isn't destroying someone, it's outlasting them, outshining them, and making their absence irrelevant. Today, when I tell this story, people always ask if I'd do it again, if I'd still sign those papers knowing how it would end. And the truth is, yes, because saving Marcus taught me how to save myself. I remember the first day I walked into my new office after everything with Marcus was over. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched, the carpet a little too worn, but it was mine. Every inch of it was a reflection of a choice I had made without compromise, without someone else pulling strings behind my back. There was no grand ribbon cutting, no press release, just me, a cup of bad coffee, and a whiteboard full of ideas. And you know what? That felt better than any applause ever could, because applause fades, ownership doesn't. Over the months, we filled that space with life. I watched as people who had once been overlooked, became leaders in their own right. I saw ideas that Marcus would have dismissed as too risky turn into campaigns that tripled our revenue. And I realized something important when you cut out the rot. Growth happens faster than you expect. From time to time, I'd hear Marcus's name float around in industry circles, usually whispered, sometimes with a smirk. Apparently, he was still trying to claw his way back, still pitching big dreams without the means to make them real. The irony was, he had taught me enough about his own weaknesses that even if he ever got close to rebuilding, I knew exactly how it would unravel again. But I didn't interfere. That part of my life was over. What people don't tell you about revenge is that it's not the act itself that changes you, it's the silence after. The way the world feels different once the fight is gone. You start to realize that your energy, your time, your focus, they're worth more than any grudge. And while I'll never forget what Marcus did, I no longer carry it like a weight. Sometimes I think about that night in the bar, before the contracts, before the chaos. If I could lean across the table and talk to my younger self, I wouldn't tell him to walk away. I'd tell him to pay attention, to listen between the lines, to notice the small betrayals before they grow into the big ones. Because the truth is, betrayal doesn't just come from the moment someone takes from you. It comes from all the times they test your boundaries, and you let it slide. That's the real lesson Marcus left me with, and I carry it into every decision I make now, not as bitterness, but as armor. So if you're listening to this, and you've been wronged, let me tell you, you don't need to rush your revenge. You don't even need to call it revenge. Build something better. Build something they can't touch. Make your life the proof that their attempt to break you didn't just fail. It made you stronger. And one day, when they look at you from the ruins of what they thought was power, they'll realize the truth. You didn't just take it all back. You took away the one thing they'll never get back, the story they thought they owned. I didn't just want to win anymore. I wanted him to feel the weight of every decision he made, the way I had felt mine. So I began weaving a plan so delicate and intricate that he wouldn't even see it coming. First, I quietly began buying back small percentages of the company stock, not directly, but through friends, shell corporations, and silent partners. The shares were worthless at first because he had run the business into the ground. But I knew exactly how to breathe life back into a dying brand, and more importantly, how to make him believe he was the one doing it. I'd accidentally leak market insights, whisper opportunities in places I knew his new team would overhear. He'd bite every time, and every time he acted on my bait, the company value would tick upward just enough for my hidden partners to snatch up more shares. Meanwhile, I planted seeds in the industry about his unreliable leadership, quiet rumors, small mistakes amplified into red flags. Investors started pulling out. Contracts began to vanish, but every time he went looking for help, I was always too busy or working on other things. Then came the night of the gala. He was glowing, thinking he had just landed a massive client, cameras flashing, champagne flowing, and then, in front of everyone, the client shook my hand instead. That's when I revealed it, the buy-out. My silent partners, my shell corporations, it had all been me. The look on his face wasn't just shock. It was recognition. He finally understood that every step he had taken had been a step I had placed in front of him. And in that moment, I whispered in his ear, "You taught me betrayal. I mastered it." The music at the gala was still playing, but the air had turned heavy. The kind of silence you can hear in your bones. He was frozen, smile plastered on his face for the cameras, but his eyes darted around like a trapped animal. And then I gave the final signal. The giant LED screen behind us flickered. First came the headline, "CEO under investigation, fraud, misappropriation, insider trading." Then, document after document rolled across the screen, bank transfers, falsified contracts, emails he thought he had deleted. The crowd gasped. Journalists surged forward. Phones lit up with breaking news alerts. I hadn't just taken his company, I had dismantled his reputation, brick by brick, until there was nothing left for him to stand on. Security arrived, but not for me. Two men in suits walked straight past me and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Sir, you need to come with us." I leaned in one last time, close enough that only he could hear me. "Remember the day you betrayed me? This is that day for you." As they escorted him out, I stood under the flashing cameras, the room buzzing with chaos. Every whisper, every stare, every headline that would follow, all of it was mine to command. And the best part, this wasn't revenge, this was justice perfected. The doors slammed shut behind him, and the echo carried through the hall like the toll of a final bell. For the first time in years, my shoulders loosened. The invisible weight I had carried, the anger, the sleepless nights, the gnawing ache of betrayal began to lift. I walked to the balcony overlooking the city, the warm night air brushing against my skin. From up here, the streets looked small, like a map I could fold into my pocket. I could see the flashing police lights below, his black luxury car abandoned by the curb, a stark symbol of a life interrupted. People approached me, some in awe, some with cautious smiles, but I barely heard them. Because in that moment, it wasn't about the crowd or the headlines or the spectacle I had orchestrated. It was about the quiet truth. I had taken back my power. I thought about the version of myself he had tried to destroy, the naive believer, the loyal partner, the dreamer who once thought betrayal was impossible. That person was gone. In their place stood someone sharper, unshakable, forged in fire, and as I stood there, the city stretching endlessly before me, I realized this wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning of an empire he would never be a part of, ChatGPT said. A sudden gust of wind whipped my hair across my face, and with it came a clarity I had never known. Below, the sirens faded into the distance, carrying him toward a fate he could no longer control. I turned away from the edge, my heels clicking against the marble floor, each step a deliberate statement that the past had no claim over me anymore. In the reflection of the tall glass doors, I saw my own eyes, calm, cold, and certain. The whispers around me grew louder, some fearful, some admiring, but I didn't slow my pace. I had already stepped out of the shadows he tried to keep me in, and now every single light in the room was mine. As I reached the grand staircase, I paused, not to look back, but to let the silence settle. He would wake tomorrow in a cell, replaying tonight again and again, knowing the final move wasn't his, it was mine. I descended slowly, like a queen returning to her throne, my heart steady, my vision fixed on the life that waited ahead. And somewhere deep inside, I promised myself, this was the last time anyone would ever mistake my kindness for weakness. ChatGPT said. A sudden gust of wind whipped my hair across my face, and with it came a clarity I had never known. Below, the sirens faded into the distance, carrying him toward a fate he could no longer control. I turned away from the edge, my heels clicking against the marble floor, each step a deliberate statement that the past had no claim over me anymore. In the reflection of the tall glass doors, I saw my own eyes, calm, cold, and certain. The whispers around me grew louder, some fearful, some admiring, but I didn't slow my pace. I had already stepped out of the shadows he tried to keep me in, and now every single light in the room was mine. As I reached the grand staircase, I paused, not to look back, but to let the silence settle. He would wake tomorrow in a cell, replaying tonight again and again, knowing the final move wasn't his, it was mine. I descended slowly, like a queen returning to her throne, my heart steady, my vision fixed on the life that waited ahead. And somewhere deep inside, I promised myself, this was the last time anyone would ever mistake my kindness for weakness. The rain began to fall, tapping softly against the glass like a quiet applause from the heavens. Each drop was a reminder of nights I had spent doubting, of years I had spent surviving. Every street we passed felt like a chapter closing, and with every mile, I shed another weight I had been carrying far too long. I wasn't just leaving a place. I was leaving a version of myself that no longer belonged in my story. The people who tried to break me, they were only the fire that forged me, the betrayals that cut deep. They were only the chisels that shaped my stone. And as the skyline faded in the rear-view mirror, I whispered to myself the truth I had bled to learn. You are not who they said you were, you are who you decide to become. The driver glanced at me in the mirror, as if sensing the weight of my words. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because when you've taken your life back, you don't waste time staring at the ruins. You walk into the sunrise and build something greater. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the life I was always meant to live.